And happy Easter again, everyone. I'm so glad to have you here, that you are part of our first celebration of Easter here at the Potter's Church. We're still in our first year of operation, our first time doing this, and it's great to have you here as we celebrate what our faith revolves around. That this is the day of days. And of course, it is what every day is supposed to be a reflection of, but we take this one especially to commemorate what Jesus did. It's a time to remember his life, his death, and his resurrection. For us to remember, but also an opportunity for us, whether it's people here or people that we go and speak to later about this. And it is a time of year when they're going to be thinking more about these things, and so it does open the door for us to be able to share the truth to those who've never maybe really heard it before, or maybe have heard it but haven't really absorbed it, haven't understood it. But their minds might be more open now, and so we are called to share with them the message that Jesus Christ is risen. And that is what it is all about. And so we are going to focus in on the truth of that today, that Jesus came back to life, and because he lives, we can find life in him. We're going to do this in John chapter 20. So if you have a Bible and you want to open it up there, that's where we'll be. And if you don't have one, but you have an electronic device and want to look it up, and want to get onto the hotel's Wi-Fi to do so, that's on the handouts that you have. But John chapter 20, and we're going to start with verse 1. It said that first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Peter therefore went out, and the other disciple, and were going to the tomb. So they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen cloths lying there, yet he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who came to the tomb first went in also, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. Then the disciples went away again to their own homes. The empty tomb. It's the first salvo in the story of the resurrection, which of course is not proof on its own. Just that the tomb was empty did not mean that Jesus was alive. It just meant that they couldn't be sure that he was dead, basically. It's the starting point. Still, that wasn't the assumption. That's not the first thought of the people who see that the tomb was empty. Not for Mary and the other women who were with her that we know about because of the other Gospels, not for Peter, and not for John, who is the other disciple who runs to the grave here. He doesn't really refer to himself by name in his Gospel, just calls himself the disciple that Jesus loved. But they don't assume that Jesus is alive. They assume that his body has been stolen, because they're not ready to believe anything other than the fact that the body is gone. That's the starting point. But it builds to more as Jesus reveals himself, which we see first with Mary. And we return to our text, and in verse 11, it says, "Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' She said to them, 'Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him.' Now when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?' And she, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away.' Jesus said to her, 'Mary.' She turned and said to him, 'Rabboni,' which is to say, 'Teacher.' And Jesus said to her, 'Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God.' Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken these things to her." Where this starts for Mary, she is, understandably, distraught. She had been convinced, she believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And that was very personal for her, because Luke chapter 8 tells us that she had been demon-possessed. But Jesus had freed her from that oppression. And from that moment on, she devoted her life to him, had followed him for years, had believed that he was the Savior. But then he died, and her heart was broken. And we have to imagine that from that 4 days earlier, from Thursday, that she had been doing nothing but weeping over this, because her heart is broken by what has occurred, what she has lost, what the world has lost. To know that Jesus is gone, and as far as they're all concerned, for nothing. He had done nothing wrong. Now, to add insult on top of injury, they can't even let him alone in death, can't give him peace in the grave, and they steal his body. And so she is crying again, blinded by her tears. And so when she sees Jesus, she does not see Jesus, cannot see clearly, cannot even really hear clearly, because she's so focused by her pain and the blood probably pounding in her ears or all the stress that she is under. And so Jesus speaks, and she doesn't recognize his voice. She turns but cannot see him until Jesus announces her name, calls her by name. And then she notices something, recognizes something, wipes away her eyes, and actually pays attention. And that is when that deepest of sorrows is replaced by unimaginable joy. Because Jesus' body is not just gone. Jesus is alive. She actually hears him, actually sees him, actually holds him, knows that he is really there. And Jesus allows her to do this for a moment, but then stops her, tells her to let go, because his mission is not yet complete, and explains to her that he is alive, but he is not there to stay, because he must ascend to heaven to do what he had promised before, right before his arrest that same night. He had told them in John chapter 14, told his disciples that he was going to his Father's house, and there were many rooms there, and he was going in order to prepare a place for them, so that where he was, there they could be. And now he is fulfilling that word, letting them know that they are going to be welcome in heaven, because clearly he is going to be welcome there. This is something that we've seen a lot in the book of Acts, how we have focused on the death of Jesus was a curse. To be hanged on a tree was to have earned God's disapproval. That was the belief. But now in his resurrection, he is vindicated. And it shows that he was not cursed, but rather he had taken our curse upon himself, and it had been nailed there and left behind. But in his resurrection, he offers life to everyone who believes in him. That is the great miracle of it, and what it proves. And it was what Mary was sent to tell the disciples, who apparently did not believe her. And so Jesus has to do yet more, which we find in verse 19. The same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. So Jesus said to them again, "Peace to you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." Understanding what the disciples were doing refers back to what we saw them doing last week with Palm Sunday. They and the crowds in Jerusalem welcoming Jesus, that their expectation was that Jesus was the Messiah, but what that meant was that he was going to lead an army into Jerusalem, and he was going to use his miracles and his soldiers in order to drive out the Romans and then to reestablish the kingdom of David. That was what they thought his goal was. Their goal was to ride his coattails, was to be able to receive positions of authority and wealth by having been his closest followers in the harder days that had occurred for them in Galilee, in the earlier part of his ministry. They had not understood what he had come to do, but now their hopes have been dashed because Jesus is dead. And that means instead of looking forward to being people of great power, now they're just co-conspirators with someone who had been executed as an insurrectionist. Their new expectation is that they can expect to receive the same treatment that he had. And so they're terrified. They hide themselves away. They try to give themselves some time and to hope that nobody finds out where they are until they have an opportunity to slink away and things have quieted down some in the city so that they can escape back to Galilee. That's all that they are hoping for at this point when Jesus appears to them. And those doors that they had locked weren't able to stop him from showing up. How could they when death couldn't even stop him? And so he shows himself, provides those many infallible proofs that the book of Acts chapter 1 talks about, that they saw his face and heard his voice and are shown his scars. They know, as Mary knew, that Jesus is alive. And it is from this that he is able to equip them, to give them peace in place of fear, and to remind them that he had been sent to save us from sin. So now they are sent to share the news of his salvation, which continues to be the Christian mission for all of us who have believed it after them, that we must continue to let everyone know of what he has done through the life that he has provided. And so that is the case for Mary. And as I said, it's the case for the other women who were with her that the other Gospels discuss. It's the case for 10 of the disciples, but that doesn't account for 2 others. Of course, Judas Iscariot is already dead at this point. He had betrayed Jesus and then regretted it and then hanged himself. But there's one more, and he's at the center of what happens moving forward from verse 24. It says, Thomas, called the twin, was one of the 12. And he was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, We have seen the Lord. So he said to them, Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days his disciples were again inside, and this time Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace to you. And then he said to Thomas, Reach your finger here and look at my hands. Reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, My Lord and my God. This, of course, is where we get the phrase doubting Thomas from. It's from Thomas the disciple, Thomas the apostle. And not just from this passage, though this one most importantly, but the few other places where he's mentioned too, because he was just a skeptic, pessimistic guy. He did believe in Jesus, he was devoted to him, but he wasn't about to believe what his friends were saying. Still stayed with them, he still continued to look out for one another, but his attitude was basically, I don't know what you guys think you saw, but I am not about to believe this. You cannot convince me that this is true. I'm going to have to see it for myself. I'm going to have to actually be allowed to hold him myself, because otherwise I am just not going to buy into this. And so after a week, we have to imagine, of constant back and forth, it was again Jesus himself who shows himself to Thomas and says, All right, you are seeing me, hearing me, and go ahead, feel me, the place where the nails went through and where the spear pierced my side. Stop doubting this. It is true. Believe. And so Thomas makes his confession, a very simple one, but one of the most important in Scripture, that in seeing Jesus, he says, My Lord and my God, acknowledging that Jesus, having laid down his life but taking it back up, had proven that he was the Lord of life, the God of creation, who had stepped down for the sake of his creation in order to give his life for ours so that we can live in him. And that is what John provides as a capstone. Really, all of John chapter 21 is a capstone, but the most important part of it, his statement of purpose, is what we find starting in verse 29 as Jesus finishes his conversation with Thomas. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And then John provides this editorial saying, Truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Believing without seeing. That's the position that all of us are in. We don't have the direct experience that the witnesses to the resurrection did. And we know that there were quite a few of them. We've seen Mary here, talked about the women, about John and Peter and the other disciples, and about Thomas later on. And then according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul there tells us about James, the brother of Jesus, who also saw him after his resurrection, and hundreds of other people, about 500 people who did so. And then finally, a few years afterward, Paul himself, basically out of season is how he refers to it. And that's it. There's nobody else who sees Jesus alive following his resurrection. For the rest of the world at the time, and for everyone who's been born afterward, we don't have that direct experience, but we do have evidence on the basis of what these witnesses left behind for us. And that's why it's so important for us to actually know it, so that we can know it for ourselves and be able to repeat it. That in the first place, Jesus certainly died. That there are some people who question that, but there's really no good grounds for questioning that. We're told in John chapter 19 that when Jesus was dead on the cross and they realized it, that they stabbed him through the side and blood and water flowed out, a clear fluid. The only way that that can happen is if the person is already dead when it happens, but also if the heart is pierced. That's what they were aiming for. The Romans were expert killers. They weren't in the business of taking living people down off of crosses, except on rare occasions where they had other tortures in mind. But they were making sure that Jesus was dead. And if he wasn't dead, they killed him. That was the whole point. He was not unconscious and buried, and then somehow got himself out of his wraps, moved a stone that would have weighed tons, fought off a number of guards who were outside, and got to his disciples, and then this mess is somehow confused for a risen Lord and God. That's not what happened here. It's not a reasonable direction to take the evidence that we have. Also, we have to realize that this certainly was Jesus who was on the cross and died there. Some people question that. The Muslims especially say that Jesus was replaced. But again, John chapter 19, we're told that Jesus had a conversation with his own mother and with John, who wrote this book. It was definitely him. He definitely died. And then after his death, again, we have the empty tomb. Not proof on its own, but certainly it can't be used against him. That was why his opponents, the first thing that they had to claim was that his body was stolen. They're admitting that the tomb is empty. If they would have said, well, wait, no, we have his body right here, if they had been able to produce him, then clearly that's the end of the story. But they couldn't do so because he was gone. And as far as the actual witnessing of his resurrected life, it is important that the first people who did so were women. That should strike us, and it doesn't necessarily because we have a pretty egalitarian society. But we have to remember that this was a patriarchal society, and the testimony of women didn't count for anything. They couldn't speak in court or in any public occasions. And so their testimony was not considered valuable. So if they were making this up, they wouldn't have made women the first witnesses. The only reason to say that they were the first people to see Jesus is very simply because they were the first people to see Jesus. It's just reporting the facts. Then all the witnesses, those hundreds of them that there were, none of them were motivated by personal gain, which would be another reason for them to tell this story, as if there was something that they could get out of it, but there wasn't. They weren't going to become powerful, they weren't going to become wealthy, and they weren't going to become famous. Infamous, maybe, as it would turn out, but certainly not famous. There was nothing for them in this. They were just sharing what they had seen. Also, and we've seen this in part, but it's really worth focusing on, is that all of the witnesses were skeptical. It's not as if they were in such a frenzy that they were easily able to convince themselves that Jesus was alive. None of them thought that he was. They all had to be convinced that he was. Mary did not notice at first. Peter and John and the other disciples did not believe her when she came and told them. Thomas refused to believe all of them. James, the brother of Jesus, was an enemy of Jesus. Essentially, he opposed his ministry. And then there's Paul, who was on his way to Damascus to hunt down Christians until he, like they, met with the Lord. And all of their skepticism was shattered by what they actually saw. And they did actually see it. Some people will argue, well, they must have hallucinated it somehow. That doesn't fit either. Because a hallucination, even if you do have an episode of mass hysteria where a number of people are hallucinating at the same time, they do not and cannot experience the same thing. Because by its very nature, a hallucination is subjective. It does not refer to any objective reality. So if they're all experiencing the same thing, then it is outside of their minds. It actually exists. And hallucinations also do not occur in multiple senses. You don't hear and see something in a hallucination, and most importantly, do not feel anything at all in a hallucination. To actually hold something, to do all of those things together, and to all be doing it across multiple locations, across multiple occasions, and with hundreds of people, a hallucination just does not stand the test. This actually happened to them. They weren't lying about it either, which of course they've been accused of very often throughout history. But they continued to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus even up until the point of death. That for anyone we have a record of, at least, of all the witnesses of Jesus, only John here died a natural death. The rest of them were martyred for what they believed about the resurrection. And people will say, well, what does that matter? There's martyrs for every religion. Yes, there are, because people will die for what they believe in. But that's the key. You die for what you believe in. You don't die for what you know is a lie. If they had made it up, if they had known that they were lying, then when they were threatened with death, they would have, whoa, hold on, no, we just made it up. The conspiracy would have broken apart. But it never did because it wasn't a conspiracy. They were just telling the truth. And they were the ones who were telling it. Because that's the last thing that's usually brought up as a challenge, is that this was really recorded a couple hundred years afterward, and that legends had developed from the time of the apostles, that all they had done was taught what Jesus taught. But this idea of him rising from the dead came far afterward. That's not true either. As a result of something that's called textual criticism, I can't really go into a lot of depth on that. Here's not the appropriate place for it, but the basic idea behind it is that with the archaeology and the study of ancient texts, we can be very certain that John was written before the year AD 90. And John is a very late book in the New Testament. Most of them were written by about the year AD 60. A few of them were written probably somewhere around the year AD 45. Only 15 years after the resurrection, at most. That all of them were written within living memory. And so they were written at the time and by the people who claimed to be the witnesses to it. It was not legendary development from later. It was the actual words of the people who lived through this moment. They were sharing what they knew to be true. And so all of this taken together lets us know that the truth of the resurrection is the only reasonable conclusion. But people doubt. So why do they doubt? Well, it's not on the basis of evidence. Doubt, first and foremost, is on the basis of an assumption. People who doubt the resurrection doubt it because they believe it's impossible. It is impossible, and therefore it could not have happened. That's the logic that they are using in making that assumption and in taking that position. Obviously, that's faith. That has nothing to do with fact. It has nothing to do with history, nothing to do with evidence. It is just their belief. And given the evidence, it is actually not reasonable. It is irrational. But that is what they do because that's how their worldview is centered. And secondly, people doubt because they don't really like how exclusive Christianity is. That's a struggle for them. Well, how can you say that the only way to be good is to be a Christian? I can be a good person without believing in God. I can be a good person by being a Muslim. I can be a good person by being Jewish or Hindu or anything else. And you know what? That is true from a certain point of view, that you can look at things that way comparatively. That yes, we'll go with Godwin's law first. Everyone's a good person in comparison to Hitler, basically. That's what everybody wants to jump to. Hey, at least I'm not him. Or yeah, you're a good person in comparison to Jeffrey Dahmer. Or yeah, a lot of these people are good people in comparison to a lot of Christians. That's a reality. That they behave more morally than many of us do. That's true. That's not the question. It misses the point. It's not about being better than some other people that you can point to. It's about being perfectly righteous, which none of us are capable of. We are all imperfect. We are all sinful. We are all selfish and proud is what that means. That's what separates us from God, because His standard is perfection. That's what we are measured against. That is what we cannot obtain on our own, and that is what Christ has offered to us, is His own perfection in place of our sin. That is what we are given. That is what we are supposed to share. That is what people want to ignore. In understanding, that's why it's exclusive. We're the only ones who have something like that to offer. Another reason why people doubt, probably the biggest one, though maybe the last one we'll mention in a moment here, it's kind of a toss-up between them. But a big reason is suffering itself. The things that go wrong in the world, particularly those things that are caused by Christians. Christian hypocrisy is off-putting to people. It drives them away from Christ. That's understandable. We have to be accountable for that. We have to recognize that when people are suffering, we should provide comfort to them, and we should not be the ones causing suffering to them. That should be our goal. But it's still just an excuse, and not a good one. Because yes, Christians can do bad things, because Christians are hypocrites, because guess what? Every single person on earth is a hypocrite. We, again, are not perfect. We all do things that we should not and do not live up even to our own standards, let alone to the standard of God. None of that is the point, because the resurrection is still true regardless of any of it. That's what has to be come to terms with. That's what demands a response, no matter anything else. And then that final reason why people doubt ultimately is self-righteousness. It kind of goes back to the earlier idea about being good without Jesus and without God, is that ultimately people just don't want to submit. They don't want to admit that they are accountable to anybody else. They want to pretend that their own way is good enough and they don't need anything else. And so they just shut their ears and close their eyes to the truth that is in front of them. But it is not, because they can ignore it, but it does not change the fact that Jesus is alive. And because He is alive, that means that there is life available in His name. That was why He was born, why He died, and why He rose again. And not to call us to follow a rule book or to keep a code as though that was what we could do to save ourselves, because again, that's just for self-righteousness. That is living in order to make ourselves the source of our own goodness, which does not work. He did all of that so that we had something to believe in. Believing in Him to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. And that's why He says in John chapter 14, in verse 6, He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He is the only way, and He proved it because He's risen. And so that is what we have to hold to. That is what Easter is all about. And for anybody who has not believed that before, and who is not a Christian, whether here or watching later, understand what a Christian is. That does not mean that you tend to go to church on Easter, or that you've been in churches more than you've been in mosques or synagogues. It's not about what you were raised as. It's about making the decision to trust that Christ is alive and that He lives for you. And that is what is available to you. That is the hope that is available to you in the truth of what we have discussed today. And I hope that you see that salvation truly is available to you. But you have a choice to make. Are you going to continue to doubt for no reason, or are you going to turn to what God is giving you and find peace in what Christ provides? And for anyone who has that decision to make, you can make it from wherever you are, and I hope that you will today. And if you have questions, that you will reach out with them. But for those of us who do know this truth, none of this is news. None of it is new. It's a story you've heard repeated many times. But it's necessary to have it repeated. It's vitally important to be reminded of the truth of the resurrection because of the encouragement of it. The world wants to remain in doubt about all of this. So they want us to doubt it too, so that we'll be quiet about it, so that we won't stand firm in it. So you need to know these things so that you can be strengthened. But you also need to know them so that you can share them, so that you can tell others, remembering that Jesus was sent to die and live again for you. And so now you, like the disciples, are called to go out and tell others for him, to let everyone know that he is risen. And because he is alive, we are free from death. That is the meaning of everything that we do. That's what we celebrate today, but it is what we can celebrate and find joy in every single day of our lives.